There exists a botanical species that has inhabited this planet for a duration far exceeding the limits of our recorded human history. It is a resilient organism that once flourished within the soil of every habitable continent, adapting to diverse climates and terrains with remarkable versatility. Every ancient civilization that possessed the foresight and the literacy to leave behind written records made significant mention of it, not merely as a curiosity of nature, but as a cornerstone of their societal health and industry. Ancient Egyptian papyri characterized it as a primary treatment for systemic inflammation. Persian physicians, the architects of early pharmacology, prescribed its derivatives for the management of acute pain and the reduction of debilitating fevers. Chinese medical texts, some dating back several centuries before the Common Era, categorized it as one of the foundational medicines of the natural world. Across every corner of the globe, indigenous healers and shamans arrived at these identical conclusions independently. They were separated by thousands of years and tens of thousands of miles of geographic isolation. Yet the empirical evidence provided by the plant was so consistent and so undeniable that its medicinal value became a universal truth. However, in the year 1910, a single institutional report fundamentally altered the trajectory of human health. This was not a scientific discovery, nor was it the result of a breakthrough in biological understanding. It was a strategic document funded by concentrated wealth that had already predetermined its desired outcomes. This report was systematically distributed to every medical school in the United States and was utilized to dismantle and reshape the entire architecture of Western medicine within a mere 15-year window. The plant did not vanish from the medical landscape because it had ceased to be effective. It was marginalized and eventually criminalized because it was too efficacious, too inexpensive to produce, and too widely available to be integrated into a profit-driven corporate model. What follows is not a speculative theory or a collection of anecdotes. It is a chronological sequence of documented events featuring real names, verified dates, and a pattern of institutional behavior so consistent that by the conclusion of this analysis, it will be nearly impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. To understand the present state of our medical system, we must return to the beginning, not to 1910, but to the deep history of human interaction with the natural world. Chapter 1. The Ancient Record and the Pharmacopeia of the Past. If one investigates the earliest botanical records for mentions of hemp, scientifically classified as cannabis sativa, the trail leads back approximately 4,700 years. In the year 2700 BCE, the Chinese Pharmacopeia, attributed to the Emperor Shennong, who is revered as the father of Chinese agriculture and traditional medicine, provided the first formal documentation of the plant. Shennong described it as a versatile treatment for over 100 distinct ailments. His observations included its efficacy in treating gout, malaria, and a condition translated as absent-mindedness. Furthermore, the texts describe its use for what modern translators identify as female weakness, a term researchers now believe referred to a broad spectrum of menstrual disorders and pelvic inflammation. This was not a collection of superstitions or folk myths. These were documented clinical observations from a civilization that had been practicing systematic medicine for centuries before these texts were even codified. The knowledge was empirical, based on generations of trial, error, and refinement. Moving westward to ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, contains specific references to cannabis preparations intended for topical application to reduce inflammation and promote healing. The Ramesseum papyri, which are even older, mention the plant specifically in the context of treating ocular conditions. These were not spiritual or religious incantations. They were precise medical instructions, authored by practitioners who were meticulously recording what worked in practice.
In the Indian subcontinent, the Atharvaveda, one of the 4 sacred texts of ancient India, lists cannabis as one of the 5 most sacred plants on earth. It describes the plant as a source of profound happiness and a liberator of anxiety, acknowledging its psychoactive and therapeutic properties in tandem. Ayurvedic practitioners, whose traditions continue to this day, utilize the plant for pain management, complex digestive disorders, and a category they defined as wasting diseases. This final category is of particular historical significance, as it refers to conditions where the body fails to maintain its mass, a phenomenon we will revisit in the context of modern pathology. Across every civilization that left a written legacy, hemp appears not as an outlier or a rare curiosity, but as a constant. It was a plant so universally recognized for its medicinal utility that cultures with absolutely no contact with one another arrived at the same pharmacological conclusions.
Such a phenomenon does not occur with plants that lack biological efficacy. Chapter 2. The Scope of Historical Treatment. Before we examine the mechanisms by which this knowledge was suppressed, it is essential to understand the breadth of what was being treated. For millennia, the plant was the primary tool for pain management, fever reduction, and the mitigation of inflammation in its many forms. It was utilized for digestive disorders, including severe nausea and cramping, as well as neurological conditions, such as seizures and tremors. It was a standard remedy for sleep disorders, anxiety, respiratory ailments, and the treatment of infected wounds. The term wasting diseases is perhaps the most telling. Historically, this referred to any condition where a patient's body literally wasted away, what modern medicine now recognizes as the cachexia associated with late-stage cancer, the effects of the AIDS virus, or severe Crohn's disease. The plant was not viewed as a mystical cure-all, but rather as a targeted therapeutic agent used by practitioners who possessed generations of observational data. By the 19th century, cannabis tinctures had become a ubiquitous product in every Western pharmacy. Even the British monarchy relied on its properties. Sir J. Russell Reynolds, the personal physician to Queen Victoria, prescribed cannabis to the monarch for decades. Writing in the prestigious medical journal The Lancet in 1890, Reynolds stated that cannabis was one of the most valuable medicines we possess, based on his extensive clinical experience. During this era, the giants of the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry, companies like Parke-Davis & Company, now a subsidiary of Pfizer, Squibb, and Eli Lilly, manufactured and sold cannabis extracts openly. In 1850, cannabis was formally added to the United States Pharmacopeia, USP, the official national list of recognized and standardized medicines. It remained on that list for 90 years, utilized by the most prestigious physicians and produced by companies that remain household names today. And then, within the span of a single generation, it was gone, rebranded as an illegal, dangerous threat to the fabric of public health. What could possibly cause such a total reversal in such a short period? Chapter 3. The Flexner Report and the Consolidation of Power. In 1908, a man named Abraham Flexner was commissioned to conduct a comprehensive survey of medical education across the United States and Canada. It is a critical detail that Flexner was not a medical doctor. He was a former school teacher and an educational theorist with no formal training in medicine or biology. The commission for this survey came from the Carnegie Foundation, but the primary funding and influence behind the project came from John D. Rockefeller. At the time, Rockefeller had already transformed Standard Oil into the most powerful corporation in American history. Having secured a monopoly over the energy sector, he was looking toward his next great frontier, the pharmaceutical industry. Rockefeller's connection to the world of medicine was direct and strategic. His business partner, Friedrich Bayer, the namesake of the Bayer Corporation, had already begun establishing a model in Germany for medicine derived from synthetic petrochemicals. Rockefeller, a master of the monopoly, realized a fundamental problem with botanical medicine. Plants cannot be patented. Anyone with a patch of soil can grow a medicinal herb. Anyone with basic kitchen tools can prepare a tincture. There is no possibility of a monopoly when the raw material is a weed that grows in every field and ditch. Synthetic compounds, however, were entirely different. A laboratory could patent a specific molecule. A corporation could control the entire supply chain, from the chemical precursors to the final pill. Furthermore, the production of these synthetics required massive industrial facilities that only the wealthiest corporations could afford to build. By shifting the focus of medicine from plants to petrochemical synthetics, the industry could create massive barriers to entry, ensuring that only a few players could survive, thereby guaranteeing perpetual profit. The Flexner Report published in 1910, was the instrument of this transformation. It concluded that the majority of American medical schools were inadequate and required immediate, drastic reform. The report recommended that all medical education be standardized around a German university model that emphasized laboratory science, physiology, and biochemistry above all else. Most importantly, it recommended the immediate defunding and closure of any school that focused on botanical medicine, homeopathy, naturopathy, or other traditional practices. The results were swift and devastating. Between 1910 and 1935, the number of medical schools in the United States plummeted from 155 to just 31. The institutions that survived were almost exclusively those that received massive grants from the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations. The schools that were forced to close were overwhelmingly those that taught the botanical traditions that had served humanity for thousands of years. As the older generation of physicians retired, they were replaced by a new class of doctors trained exclusively in the modern petrochemical model. Within 20 years, an entire branch of human knowledge was effectively erased from the official curriculum of the Western world. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a matter of public record. One can go to any major university library and read the Flexner Report today. One can cross-reference the dates of medical school closures with the distribution of Rockefeller grants. The paper trail is undeniable. Chapter 4. The Tartarian Hypothesis and the Erasure of Knowledge. To understand the full depth of this suppression, we must look at a perspective that is increasingly gaining traction among historical researchers, the Tartarian hypothesis. This framework suggests that the transition in 1910 was not the beginning of a project, but rather the final stage of one. The hypothesis posits that the narrative we have been given of a slow, linear progression from primitive ancestors to modern technological humans is fundamentally flawed. It suggests that prior to the 19th century, there existed a global civilization of significant sophistication, one that possessed an advanced understanding of natural medicine and energy that we are only now beginning to rediscover. Chapter 4. The Tartarian Hypothesis and the Erasure of Knowledge. To understand the full depth of this suppression, we must look at a perspective that is increasingly gaining traction among historical researchers, the Tartarian hypothesis. This framework suggests that the transition in 1910 was not the beginning of a project, but rather the final stage of one. The hypothesis posits that the narrative we have been given of a slow, linear progression from primitive ancestors to modern technological humans is fundamentally flawed. It suggests that prior to the 19th century, there existed a global civilization of significant sophistication, one that possessed an advanced understanding of natural medicine and energy that we are only now beginning to rediscover. In this context, the botanical medicine traditions were not primitive precursors to real science. They were the refined remnants of a far more complete and holistic system of knowledge. This system was allegedly dismantled in stages, first through the chaotic events of the mid-1800s, which some researchers refer to as a reset, and then finalized through institutional mechanisms like the Flexner Report. By cutting the institutional memory of the medical profession, the architects of this new system ensured that the knowledge of the past could not be passed down to future generations. Consider the biological evidence. The endocannabinoid system, the complex network of receptors in the human body that interacts directly with the compounds found in cannabis, was not officially described by science until 1992. This system regulates a staggering array of critical functions, including pain perception, mood, immune response, appetite, and sleep. The human body has a dedicated, built-in receptor system for a plant that was made illegal decades before the system was even discovered. From an evolutionary standpoint, the body evolved to work with these plant compounds over millions of years. In the Tartarian framework, the people before the reset already understood this biological relationship. They didn't need to name the receptors to know that the plant was a vital key to human homeostasis. And then, that key was taken away. Chapter 5. The Legislative War and the Invention of Marijuana. While the Flexner Report reshaped how doctors were trained, it did not immediately make the plant illegal. That required a separate, multi-pronged legislative campaign. Each move built upon the last, using different justifications, ranging from tax revenue to public safety, but all leading toward the same eventual prohibition. The first major move was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. While framed as a simple revenue measure and a tax on opium and coca derivatives, it established the federal government's authority to regulate and restrict substances that had previously been sold freely. This set a dangerous legal precedent. Then came the era of Harry Anslinger. Anslinger was appointed as the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. He was a career bureaucrat and a former prohibitionist who saw his department's funding and relevance threatened when alcohol prohibition ended in 1933. He needed a new devil to justify his agency's existence. Anslinger's campaign against cannabis was built almost entirely on fabricated stories of extreme violence and racial contamination. He utilized tabloid newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst, who had his own financial interests in protecting his timber-based paper empire from hemp competition, to portray the plant as a drug that turned users, specifically users of color, into violent criminals. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was the culmination of this propaganda. It did not technically ban the plant, but it imposed a tax and a bureaucratic burden so extreme that any legal transaction became an economic impossibility. The American Medical Association, AMA, was one of the few organizations to oppose the act. Dr. William Woodward, representing the AMA, testified before Congress that the medical profession had not been consulted and that the legislation was both unnecessary and harmful to the practice of medicine. He pointed out that cannabis had legitimate, documented medical applications. For his efforts, he was publicly ridiculed by the committee chairman, and his testimony was completely ignored. Curiously, the pharmaceutical industry, now fully aligned with the Rockefeller model, offered no opposition. By 1942, cannabis was officially removed from the United States Pharmacopeia. 92 years of official medical recognition were erased in a 5-year legislative sprint. The linguistic shift during this period was also a masterstroke of social engineering. The word marijuana, a Spanish-inflected term, was deliberately used by Anslinger and his allies to distance the legislation from the words cannabis and hemp. Most Americans in 1937 associated hemp with rope, sales, and medicine. If Congress had attempted to ban cannabis preparations, physicians and farmers would have recognized the threat immediately. By using the word marijuana, the plant was made to sound foreign, dangerous, and associated with populations that the lawmakers of that era were already predisposed to fear. Chapter 6: Modern Science and the Return of the Suppressed. The most tragic aspect of this history is what modern research has confirmed since the door was cracked open in the 1990s. In 1996, California became the first state to legalize medical cannabis, allowing researchers to finally apply modern analytical tools to the plant. What they found was a validation of the ancient records. In 2018, the FDA approved Epidiolex, a CBD-based drug for severe childhood epilepsy, the very same falling sickness described in ancient texts thousands of years ago. Cannabis compounds have been found to possess potent anti-inflammatory properties that work across multiple biological pathways. We now know that chronic inflammation is the primary driver of nearly every major degenerative disease, from heart disease and cancer to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Laboratory studies have shown that certain cannabinoids can inhibit the growth of tumor cells and even trigger programmed cell death in certain cancer lines. While these findings are published in peer-reviewed journals, large-scale clinical trials remain nearly impossible because the plant remains a Schedule I controlled substance, a classification that legally defines it as having no medical value. The connection to wasting diseases also returned during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 90s. Patients suffering from extreme weight loss found that cannabis was one of the only substances that could stimulate appetite and allow them to maintain the strength to fight the disease. The institutional response was telling. The FDA approved Marinol, a synthetic, patentable version of THC, in 1985. The plant itself remained a criminal offense, but the synthetic, corporate-controlled version of one of its molecules was deemed an approved medicine. If there is a more perfect illustration of the profit over health model, it is difficult to find. Chapter 7. The Global Implication and the Industry's Secret.
Today, approximately 80% of the world's population still relies on plant-based medicine as their primary form of healthcare. This is not because they are backwards, but because pharmaceutical medicine is priced far beyond the reach of most of humanity. These plants work. The evidence of their efficacy is not anecdotal. It is the accumulated data of 5 millennia of human observation. In cultures where the wrong medicine meant death, there was a powerful incentive to be accurate.
The mainstream narrative tells us that we have moved past folk remedies through the triumph of science. But this narrative requires us to ignore the fact that the medicine which replaced the plants has failed to cure the most significant diseases of our time. It has failed to stop the rise of autoimmune disorders, and it has created a system where health is a commodity, available only to those who can afford it. The Tartarian researchers suggest that we once had a much deeper, more effective relationship with the natural world, one that was systematically stolen from us to create a captive market of consumers. Whether or not one accepts the full historical reset theory, the documented facts remain. The names, the dates, the funding sources, and the legislative maneuvers are all there in the record. A plant that was used medicinally for at least 5,000 years was criminalized in a single generation through a combination of fabricated propaganda, corporate greed, and regulatory capture. This happened. It is not a theory. It is our history.